Today we shall continue with the second part of the Olivet Discourse, which cover Matthew 24 and Matthew 25. In my last sermon, Jesus closed with the lesson of a fig tree to remind the disciples about the nearness of his coming so that they will be well prepared. Since we do not know the time of his return, I believe our attitude in response to his prophecy is important. And this is what this sermon is all about. How are we going to respond to his second coming? In fact, Jesus in the book of Revelation, he reminded John again, the time is very near. In verse 1, it says, the revelation must soon take place. And verse 3 says, blessed are those who hear it and take to heart what is written in it, because the time is near. Therefore, we should live each day as though it were our last to keep ourselves prepared. See, we are living in the time I call in between. The kingdom of God, which has already here, but not yet in full. So how much time do we actually have to prepare ourselves for the coming of the Lord? And to many it looks like forever, but at the same time we feel like it is very near as we look at the signs around us. Sometimes we feel a little bit confused and like being trapped in the time frame. But let me give you an illustration to describe actually how much time do we have or how we've trapped in that situation. If you look at the slide, I believe many of us are very familiar with this very old video game called Tetris. It was played many years ago and it was voted as one of the world's coolest video game in existence. I think many of us has played this game before, and I guess many have get addicted to it as well. And for those who have no idea how this video game goes, let me explain to you. See, at the start of the game, you will see a series of differently shaped blocks descended from the top of the screen. And the goal was to line up the blocks like a puzzle, clearing each row of blocks and buying yourself more time. As you begin to play, you feel that you have a lot of time because the blocks that come down is by a different shape and you will take your own sweet time to arrange it. But no matter how skilled you are, every player eventually experiences what I call the time-changing moment, when the block started coming more quickly and the margin error shrank to hairbreadth. And this is just like the message of the second coming of the Lord. See, though we do not know the time, but Jesus is telling us that we are living in that game-changing moment of history. Each day is significant, taking us closer to the imminent end. We have limited time and fleeting opportunity to live a life of faithfulness. So we must also be prepared, ready, be responsible, and accountable to our life which God had given to us in expectant of His return. Now we are already in the month of May. I still remember when the pandemic was first alerted in Malaysia way back in February. People was in a mad rush to store up food as if the end is near. It created fear. Again, this is the normal reaction for us to be prepared when we are warned of the impending danger like COVID-19. But what about Jesus' second coming? Jesus has been telling us of his second coming many years ago. But how many Christians are actually prepared compared with the preparation that we made for the pandemic? In the second part of the discourse, after Jesus telling the disciple of the event that going to take place before he comes, now he turns to teach them about how they should prepare themselves for his coming. they are to watch, for they do not know when he is coming. He then told them four parables that give variation on the theme. Each teach a particular point about how and why they should be prepared. We are to wait alertly and in expectation of reward at his return, because the unprepared and unrepentant will receive only judgment. Then Jesus begins with a startling but central truth of his coming and the end of age. He says, "No one knows but only the Father." And in his earthly ministry, we see Jesus came to do the will of his Father in heaven. And it was not the Father's will for him to know the date of his return during his time on earth. In the light of the unknown day and hour, he exhorts his disciples to watch and be prepared. You see, even Jesus do not know the time of his coming. And Jesus emphasizes that the unexpectedness of his return by making a comparison to the time of Noah. The people in the days of Noah did not heed the warnings of judgment that were given to them. They continued to carry on in the everyday activities of eating and drinking, marrying and giving their children in marriage. Although this was a corrupted generation, but Jesus' point is not that these activities were sinful, but the people were so wrapped up in everyday activities that they were caught off guard because they had no concern for righteousness and spiritual realities. Then in the following passage, we see Jesus use four parables to teach the disciple and reminding them how they should respond to his coming. And in parable 1, we see the parable of the homeowner and the thief. Jesus draws a comparison between his coming and the unexpectedness of a thief's activity. And in this parable, it stresses that vigilance, alertness, and watchfulness is necessary if a thief should appear. See, the onus is on the house owner. A house owner can relax if he knows at what part of the night a thief is going to try to break in. But since he doesn't, he has to keep watch all night long. And the same is the case for Jesus' disciple and all of us. Since we do not know the hour of his coming, we must continue to keep watch all through the ages, because he can come at any time. Then Jesus moved on to tell the second parable about the two kinds of servants. There is a faithful one and the unfaithful one. The faithful servant is a chief servant who takes care of his master's household, affair and stuff. And the test here is his responsibility occurs when the master is absent. Imagine when the master is not around, how shall a servant behave, or how shall he perform his duty in the absence of the master? And likewise, this also reveals another kind of servant in the house, the unfaithful servant. And the long absence of his master allows the servants to abuse his authority, mistreat his fellow servants, and associate drunkenly with bad acquaintances. In this parable, it reveals the moral nature of both servants, the faithful and the unfaithful, indicating their relationship to the kingdom of God. This parable is not talking about rewards or punishment for believers. Rather, it is a contrast between true and false believers, and addresses the consequences of those who show their lives that they are deserving of hell. And what prompts the servant's wickedness is he's noticing that his master has been away a long time. This could happen to us today as we have been waiting for his return, but he never came. So the way one thinks about the Lord's return will eventually influence what one says and how we behave and act. Perhaps the servant thinks that the master will never return or that he can get away with his wickedness before he is caught. And this may be a subtle hint here that Jesus' return will be delayed, which will act as a test to the heart of each person. And in parable 3, the parables of the 10 virgins. In this parable, it specifically teaches readiness in the light of the unknown time of the coming of the Son of Man. The 10 virgins are bridesmaids who are not married. Following a typical Jewish marriage custom, a groom left his parents' home with a contingent of friends to go to the home of his bride. The nuptial ceremonies were carried out. After this, the entire wedding party formed a processional to a wedding banquet, normally at the home of the bridegroom. And the catch of this parable is that no one knows when the groom will arrive. And because of the long wait, all 10 of the bridesmaids became drowsy and fall asleep. And of the 10, 5 were foolish because they came unprepared for the long waiting hour, which they did not take extra oil with them. While in the middle of the night the bridegroom finally arrived. It was then the foolish bridesmaid realized that without extra oil in their lamp, they would be completely out. So while the foolish virgins were off to find oil, the procession with the bridegroom finally arrives. But only the 5 wise virgins who had prepared extra oil for their lamps were able to join the procession to the wedding banquet. After Jesus telling the parables of the 10 virgins, he continued with the parables of the talents. And this story is closely associated with the daily occurrence of the people in the land. And those who hear this parable, they will understand what Jesus is saying. And oftentimes a wealthy landowner entrusted their property and affair to trustworthy servants when they went away on business. 3 servants were called and were given a different amount with each according to his ability. The first and the second servants immediately make effective use of the entrusted amount, and they make returns for his master. But the third servant simply digs a hole into which he placed his master's 1 talent. After a long interval, the master returns to settle the account with them. And the master is pleased with the 2 servants who had made a good return by putting them in charge of many things. But when the master found out the third servant did not make any, he was mad and instructed him to be thrown outside into the darkness. The wickedness of the third slave primarily stems from his misperception about his master, which in turn has led to laziness and bad stewardship. After telling the 4 parables, now we see the scene switches to the glorious coming of the Son of Man. And we see Jesus is accompanied in his glory with all the angels, and he sits on his throne of glory. And before him all the nations will be gathered, and he will separate the people one from another as shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. Sheep is a consistent image of the people of God, whether it refers to Israel or Jesus' disciple. And the king gives the explanation for the separation as he says to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father. Take your inheritance, the kingdom." Kingdom inheritance is a reward for caring for Jesus' physical needs. And these acts of mercy are the result of transformation by the Spirit and is shown through the external behavior of a person who has truly received the gift of salvation. So what are the lessons that we can learn from all the parables here? In the past, we often hear from some speaker, including myself, we will preach a sermon from a single parable. But today we're going to look at it from a different perspective. And we try to draw the lesson by combining all the parables. And what is the lesson that Jesus is trying to tell us in all those parables? Jesus' intent in the present chapter is not to give a timetable. He focuses on attitude and character. How should we respond to his second coming? If you look carefully, there are two strong words appeared in this section: the suddenness and the preparedness. The suddenness of the return of the Son of Man permits each parable or each scene. And secondly, in the context of peace or trouble, we must be prepared for the Lord's return regardless of our circumstances. We do not wait for signs to appear to get ourselves prepared. Some people focus so much on Jesus' return in glory at the end of the period of tribulation that they exhibit little concern to prepare now, thinking that they can wait until they see the events of the end begin to unfold and then they will prepare. In the light of the facts that the time of his return is unknown, we should live with the certain expectation that the end is near for each of us. And this could in effect affect our daily discipleship to him. The preparedness will justify or determine either blessing at the coming of the Son of Man or judgment. And so we must keep watch and be ready all the times. Appropriate watching must be accompanied with appropriate kinds of preparedness. Now let us see what is the relationship or what is the connection between the parables that Jesus is telling his disciple. The parable of the homeowner and thieves set the stage for how we should live our lives in preparation that Jesus will return. We are to watch diligently, and the rest of the parable demonstrate how we should respond. What should our attitude be? And there are three things here. It says we must be responsible in the story of two kinds of servants. And in the 10 virgins, Jesus is teaching us that we must be ready. And the following parables of the talents, again Jesus reminded us that we must be productive. And the concluding scenes of the judgment of the sheep and the goats require us to be accountable to our discipleship. So how shall we respond to his second coming? And in this story, Jesus reminded us that we must be responsible. Someone has said well, says, live each day so that you will neither be afraid of tomorrow nor ashamed of yesterday. In this parable of two kinds of servants taught us to be faithful in carrying out our responsibility. We are responsible for the things that have been entrusted to us. A faithful and a good heart live righteously regardless of circumstances, whether the master is away or present. And let me share with you a little bit of my teaching experience. If you look at the slide, you will see the little island that called Pulau Ketam. And it was my first posting to that island. I was posted to a place called Kampung Sungai Lima at Pulau Ketam. And that was also my last. Some of my friends mistaken that I was sent to this fantasy island. And as a teacher, my responsibility was to teach the students. Since our college year, we were told to carry out our duty faithfully by our lecturer, as no one would dare to observe us every day. So this is our responsible to teach. Now, of course, once in a while, the officer from the district education department will come to invigilate our lesson without prior notice. In other words, we do not know when he or she will come, and we need to be prepared at all times. But my headmaster was a kind person. He told us in the event of the invigilator is coming, he told us not to worry. He said he would inform us if there was someone coming to the school to invigilate. And so we were curious. We asked him how he knew. Did he have some insider connection? And he said no, he did not need that. But this is what he told us. You see, Pulau Ketam is a very interesting place. To get to Pulau Ketam, you need to travel by boat for nearly an hour, and there are not many trips to Sungai Lima. And if any officer wants to visit the school, he or she needs to make prior booking with the boat operator. And usually the boat operator will inform the school whenever we have visitors coming. So in that way, we will be prepared. But this is a completely opposite of what Jesus said. We do not know when is his second coming. But the point is that we need to be prepared at all times, regardless of the circumstances. As a servant of God, we should be responsible in whatever duty that has been entrusted to us. Our chosen career path means that we serve God dutifully through our work, whether it is sacred or secular. Always remember, we have an audience of one. No matter where we are responsible to the audience of one. Then in the story of the 10 virgins, Jesus teaches that we must be ready. So are we ready when Jesus returns? In this parable, readiness is the key word here, in anticipation of bridegroom coming at an unexpected time for his bride. Now, I believe all of us have the experience of taking a ride from someone. What do you do? I believe you will get ready earlier before the appointed time. Brother Kebing would always tumpang my car to church every Sunday before the MCO. But regardless of whether I'm early or late, he will always be ready, sitting outside of his gate, waiting for me. I think that should be our attitudes toward waiting for the return of our Lord. We should be ready at all times. The pandemic had caught the world by surprise. Many countries are not ready to handle this pandemic, even though they were warned as early as in November 2019. And what about us as a church? As the MCO is extended, what is the level of our readiness in anticipating of no mass gathering in the future? The parable points out the personal nature of our relationship to the Lord. Our commitment and desire to see Jesus face to face when he comes for us should encourage us to prepare appropriately. And in the story of the talents, Jesus reminds us that we must be productive. The talents symbolize the giftedness that is given to each person and how we use our gifts in the service of the kingdom. Not everyone is gifted with the same gifts of the Spirit, yet each of us can be productive in our own ways. I guess the pertinent question that we want to ask here is, What is the cause that makes some productive and other not? The parable teaches that a truthful understanding of God will bring about the productive investment of our lives. The inaccurate views of God allow us to rationalize our own irresponsibility and unfaithfulness. The explicit problem with the wicked servant is his attitude about his master, which in turn has led to laziness and bad stewardship. The way he conceived of him, he says, "You are a hard man," causes him to fear and then to hide away the talent and not to seek to advance the master's capital. All our service in the kingdom is essentially valuable, whether it is in sacred or in secular, whether it receive a greater or lesser return. Our responsibility is to plan long haul and use our giftedness to advance the kingdom of God. At the end of the day, Jesus reminds us, no matter who we are accountable. The scenes of the judgment of the sheep and the goats bring these parables and the discourse to a dramatic conclusion with the pronouncement that we will be accountable for what we do in this life while awaiting the return of the King. And so what is true discipleship in the kingdom life? The true discipleship is follow the footsteps of Jesus. Our humbly ministry to the lowliest is the evidence of kingdom life. A heart that has been transformed by the righteousness of the kingdom of God will serve out humility. The presence of the kingdom life will always produce evidence in the transformed speech, in our thoughts, action, and characters, and in our daily living. We serve because we have been served. We love because we have been loved. The primary responsibility is that we must care for those of the household of faith, but also all of God's creatures. God truly loved the world and desired that none should perish. Our final judgment is not by the greatness of public ministry and religious duty, not something that we do openly every day for people to see, but the ministry that flows from humility of Jesus' own heart for the needy among us. And finally, how sure are we of his return? In closing, let me share with you an article which I read recently. Jesus, during his resurrection in the Gospel of John, as we read, he left a very obvious hint to all of us that he is coming back. In the Gospel of John, in chapter 20, verse 7, tells us that the napkin which was placed over the face of Jesus was not just thrown aside like the grave clothes, but in fact it was folded nicely and placed at the bed. And why did Jesus fold the linen burial cloth after his resurrection? The Bible takes an entire verse to tell us that the napkin was neatly folded and was placed at the head of the stony coffin. In the early Sunday morning of the resurrection, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and found that the stone had been rolled away from the entrance. She ran and found Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved. She said, "They have taken the Lord's body out of the tomb, and I don't know where they have put him." Peter and the other disciple ran to the tomb to see. The other disciple outran Peter and got there first. He stopped and looked in and saw the linen cloth lying there. But he didn't go in. Then Simon Peter arrived and went inside. He also noticed the linen wrappings lying there, while the cloth that had covered Jesus' head was folded and lying to the side. So was that important? Absolutely. Is it really significant? Yes. In order to understand the significance of the folded napkin, you have to understand a little bit about Hebrew tradition of the day. The folded napkin had to do with the master and servant, and every Jewish boy knew this tradition. When the servant set the dinner table for the master, he made sure that it was exactly the way the master wanted it. The table was furnished perfectly, and then the servant would wait just out of sight until the master had finished eating, and the servant would not dare touch the table until the master was finished. Now, if the master were done eating, he would rise from the table, wipe his fingers, his mouth, and clean his beard, and would squeeze up the napkin and toss it on the table. The servant would then know to clear the table, for in those days the weighted napkin meant I am finished. But if the master got up from the table and folded his napkin and laid it aside by his plate, the servant would not dare touch the table, because the folded napkin meant I am coming back. Yes, that was what Jesus is telling us. With the folded napkin, he's telling us he is coming back. Are you ready?